This case is yet another reminder that it could be anyone behind the profile on a dating app. 40-year-old nurse Ingrid Lyne had been divorced from her husband Phil for 2 years. The pair shared custody of their 3 daughters. On Saturday, April 9th, 2016, Phil was dropping their daughters off at Ingrid's house in Renton, Washington. He noticed her car was not in the driveway, and after knocking on the door for several minutes, he realized she wasn't home. This was strange because Ingrid was never late and the pair had agreed on a meeting time. Now, he couldn't get a hold of her by phone, so he called her mother, Georgia, who had a key to the house. Georgia drove over and let Phil and the girls into the house, and then she noticed Ingrid's purse and phone were still there. This is when she gets very worried and calls 911. After speaking to one of Ingrid's friends, they find out that Ingrid had been on a date the night before, and her friend had last texted with her at 10:30 p.m. Ingrid's neighbor told police that Ingrid had been dating a man named John. They met on the Plenty of Fish website and had been together for several weeks. She also knew that Ingrid and John had plans to go to the Mariners game around 7 p.m. on April 8th. No one knew who John was, but Georgia shared a Verizon account with her daughter, so she logged in to see if she could get his number. She immediately saw that one number kept popping up, so she texted to see who it was. It turned out it was John, and he confirmed that he had gone out with Ingrid the night before. They were at the Mariners game, but he didn't stay the night because she planned to have her girls early the next day. Still knowing very little about John, Ingrid's sister took the phone number and put it into Facebook and got the results of a John Charlton. Georgia texted him one more time to let him know they were very worried about Ingrid and where she was and that she had contacted the police. He never replied. The next day, about 10 miles away, a man made a grisly discovery. He was pulling his recycling from the curb and realized it was still full. That was curious because the recycling had already been picked up. He dumped out the contents to find 3 heavy garbage bags, and through the plastic of one of them, he saw a human face. Over the next few days, police discovered pieces of Ingrid's body among the recycling throughout the greater Seattle area. After searching her home, they found evidence that John had killed her and dismembered her in her bathtub with a pruning saw. He then drove her car around Seattle, disposing of her in at least 3 different areas. John Charlton had several arrests across 6 different states. He was currently homeless and staying with an ex-girlfriend. He was arrested for Ingrid's murder on April 11th, and it took over a year, but he finally admitted to strangling her to death during his trial in 2017. He was sentenced to 27 years and 9 months. No one will ever know what Ingrid actually knew about the man she was dating, but thanks to him, parts of her will never be found, and her 3 daughters no longer have a mother. On April 13th, 1993, 15-year-old Melissa Lee was home alone in Bothell, Washington. At around 9:30, she spoke to her mom on the phone and learned she'd be home in a few hours. When her mom arrived home just after midnight, Melissa was gone, and there were signs of a struggle. There was also a strange chemical smell lingering in the home. She called police, and it was treated as an abduction right away. Within hours, Melissa's body was found in a ravine. She had been raped, strangled, and thrown off of a bridge in Everett, Washington. DNA was discovered at the crime scene, so several samples were taken and saved. During her autopsy, no drugs and alcohol were found in Melissa's blood, but they did find 2 chemicals, ether and heptane. Ether was used as an anesthetic in the 1800s. Several leads were pursued, but one in particular stood out to police, a 35-year-old man named Alan Edward Dean. But they had no concrete evidence linking him to the crime. That was not for 27 years. When investigating the 1993 murder of Melissa Lee, police got their primary suspect from a phone number scrawled next to the name Michael in Melissa's address book. After calling the number, they learned that Michael was actually Alan Dean, a 35-year-old man that met Melissa on a phone hotline. Night Talk Line was kind of like Bumble in the old days. When interviewed, he did not deny knowing Melissa. In fact, he confirmed her diary entry that they went out a few times. But he did deny a sexual relationship with her. Police thought they had their man, and they interviewed him at least 3 times, but they only had circumstantial evidence. However, 27 years after Melissa's murder, they finally got the breakthrough they needed. In recent years, Washington state authorities have not been shy about sending cold case DNA samples to Parabon Nanolabs for testing. The company helps by analyzing the DNA and then finding a genome that can be uploaded to a public genealogy website. This worked, and they found a familial match. After using public genealogy to locate a familial match, police narrowed in on Alan Dean, now 62 years old. They put him under surveillance in the hopes that they could find an opportunity to get a DNA sample. In an unbelievable tactic that seems straight out of a movie, they went to his door and offered him new flavors of gum, like some kind of market research. When they asked him to spit the gum into a cup, he grew suspicious and it failed, so they ended up collecting a discarded cigarette butt. This ends up being a match, so they get a warrant to search his garage, and in his garage is starter fluid. It has both ether and heptane present, the same chemicals found in Melissa's blood. Dean gets arrested, and he's got nothing but red flags. In his 20s, a 13-year-old girl claimed that he gave her alcohol and drugs and touched her inappropriately. Another woman claimed on a first date he raped her. Dean's now held on $2 million bail, and he's waiting for trial. They have a strong case, but this guy is claiming he's not a citizen, so it's sure to be interesting. As of April 2021, Alan Dean had all charges against him dropped because he was declared unfit for trial. He will be in a mental institution indefinitely. In the future, if he's declared fit, the charges will be brought back up against him. Uncle Joe, Part 1, here's why you can't trust everyone in your life. In November of 1996, 12-year-old Kara Rudd and her cousin are dropped off at school. As they stand outside, an adult family friend drives up in his Firebird to say hi. Kara goes to the car, chats for a bit, and he drives away. She then asks her cousin if she wants to skip school. The cousin declines, so Kara walks away on her own, and she never comes home, and she's never seen again. As police investigate, they meet a woman who says they saw Kara get into the car with a man and they drive away. For weeks, police investigate, but they have very few clues, but they are interested in this family friend, Joe. A man comes forward and says he has a buddy, Joe Kondro, who he likes to party with at Mount Solo near the Columbia River in Washington State. Police search this area and they find an abandoned car, and hidden beneath it is the body of Kara. She had been raped and murdered, and DNA left on her body belonged to Joe Kondro. As he awaited trial, he made a shocking confession. Go to Part 2. Uncle Joe, Part 2. So Joe is about to go on trial for the murder of Kara, and he's up against the death penalty. That's when he makes a shocking confession. He's done it before, and he can help them solve a long, cold case. So let's go back to May of 1985. A little 8-year-old named Rima Traxler goes missing on her way home from school. As she walked home, she stopped at a neighbor's to show off artwork. Then no one sees her again. For years, police try to find evidence that her stepfather, Rusty Traxler, was the one that did it. But the case went cold. It wasn't until a decade later that they learned the truth. Joe Kondro had been Rusty's alibi the day Rima went missing. Joe knew Rima was walking home, and he also knew the special code word to get her in his car, unicorn. Joe spoke that word and she got in the car. He drove her to the woods, raped her, murdered her, and left her body in a shallow grave. Rima's body was never recovered, and Joe Kondro died in prison. The Murder of Tina Stewart, Part 1. On Thanksgiving in 2017, Tina Stewart and her boyfriend Nicholas Holden decided to spend the holiday with Nick's father in Newman Lake, Washington. After their holiday meal, Nick's father showed them how to use the jacuzzi and excused himself to bed so the two could be alone. At some point in the night, the father awoke to a noise, but finding nothing suspicious, he went back to bed. The next morning, he found his son on the phone with his mother on the driveway. He then went to the basement and discovered Tina, covered in blood and lying lifeless on the floor. That's when he called police. Deputies and fire rescue arrived on the scene and were unable to revive Tina. They noted that she had severe trauma to her body consistent with physical assault. When asked what happened to Tina, Nick said, "We got into it last night. It was bad." When detectives arrived, they noted that Nick had injuries on his hands consistent with assault. He eventually waived his rights and agreed to an interview, and that's when they learned the horrible truth. Go to Part 2. The Murder of Tina Stewart, Part 2. Nick told them everything. After his father went to bed, the pair got into an argument. He claims that Tina started throwing things at him, slapping him, and even threatening to get a knife. This is when he says he cracked. He shoved her onto the bed and began hitting and kicking her. He told the police that after a while, the two just passed out and went to sleep. He woke up around 4 a.m. and noticed that Tina had blood and vomit on her face, was cool to the touch, and unresponsive. So he wiped it away and went back to sleep. He then wakes up a few hours later and realizes what happened to Tina, freaks out, and calls his mom. That's when his father walks in and discovers Tina's body. Detectives arrest Nick for second-degree murder and hold him on $500,000 bond. Initially, he pleaded not guilty, but eventually he pled out and got 16 years for a guilty plea. One of Tina's friends, Stephanie, who introduced her to Nick, reflects on the reason he was set off that night, and we learn a lot about their history. Go to Part 3. The Murder of Tina Stewart, Part 3. While there were some signs of abuse, it was not that outwardly apparent. Tina's friends and family would be shocked to find out more about Nick's history. Her friend Stephanie and her ex Andrew had a little bit of information that made them concerned about her welfare. A while into Tina and Nick's relationship, Tina's ex Andrew, who she shared a child with, made some comments to Stephanie that their child was talking about Nick being violent with their mom. When Stephanie had brought this up to Tina, she denied it. However, Tina eventually confided in Stephanie that the pair were getting couples counseling because of Nick's anger issues. In the summer of 2017, Tina told her ex Andrew that she was planning to leave Nick. But in order to leave, she needed to plan an exit strategy. This is very common with women in abusive relationships. But of course, that plan would never happen because by Thanksgiving, she would be dead at her boyfriend's hands. Go to part 4. The murder of Tina Stewart, part 4. Tina Stewart was making plans to leave her abusive boyfriend Nick, but she didn't get out in time. Her friends and family can't help but think it could be drastically different if our laws were different. When Nicholas Holden went before the court for beating his girlfriend to death, Tina's family was shocked to discover that he had a very well-documented violent past. This spurred the family into action, advocating for domestic violence victims. Tina's uncle, Don Estes, has worked to pursue a new law called Tina's Law. This would implement a registry for domestic abuse offenders in all states. This is similar to a law in Britain called Clare's Law, which allows people to find out if their partner has a violent past. Tina's Law was shot down in 2019 before it could even see a vote. Opposers claimed publicizing abusers' names would often lead to the identification of the victim. Jody Loomis, Part 1. On August 23, 1972, 20-year-old Jody Loomis rode her bike to the horse stables in Bothell, Washington. As an avid horseback rider, she made this trip often, usually with a friend, but on this particular day, she made the trip alone. A witness saw Jody cross the road on her bike at around 5 p.m., and by 5:30, her body was found on the side of Penny Creek Road. Jody was nude and bleeding. She had been shot in the head right above her right ear. She was alive when she was discovered, but she died in the ambulance on the way to the hospital. An autopsy determined that prior to being shot, Jody had been sexually assaulted. Police had no leads, and no witnesses saw Jody interacting with anyone on her bike route. Over 40 years went by with no arrests. It's safe to say the case was ice cold, but they did have DNA. Jody had been wearing boots that day, and on one of the boots was semen. Police saved the sample for the future when technology could help. Go to Part 2. Jody Loomis, Part 2. 40 years after Jody Loomis was murdered on her way to ride her horse, DNA collected at the crime scene was sent to Parabon Nanolabs. They extracted a DNA profile and uploaded it to a public genealogy website, and lo and behold, there was a match. Police narrowed in on a 77-year-old man named Terrence Miller. Miller was living in Edmonds, Washington with his wife and selling ceramics out of his garage. Police began round-the-clock surveillance on him and waited for their perfect moment. While Miller enjoyed a night out at the casino, he sipped a cup of coffee and threw away the cup. That's when police swooped in and collected the cup. It was tested against the DNA and again, a match. Miller was arrested in 2019 and charged with first-degree murder. He had $1 million bail, which he met, and went home to wait for trial. The trial began in November of 2020, and while the jury deliberated on his guilt, he took his own life. While he was found guilty, he never had to do any jail time for the murder of Jody Loomis. Death row inmate James Homer Eldridge, Part 1. James Homer Eldridge started his life of crime and alcohol abuse at the age of 10. When he was a child, his sister died. By the time he was a teen, 2 of his brothers committed suicide, so it's safe to say he struggled through his formative years. In his 20s, he took his petty crimes up a notch and robbed a Western Union in New Mexico, and he left with more than just money. He kidnapped a young woman who worked there, raped her, and then knocked her unconscious with the butt of his gun. He then covered her body in gasoline, and while he looked for a lighter to set her on fire, she came to and ran for her life. Luckily, she survived. He gets sentenced to up to 50 years. And somehow escapes from prison. He gets captured and they add to his sentence, but somehow he still only serves a little over 7 years. Once he's free, he moves to Seattle, Washington, where he rents a motel room from an elderly woman named Bertha Lush. They get into some kind of dispute and he beats her to death with a ball-peen hammer. Sentenced to another 15 years, but gets out again. You think he learns his lesson, right? Nope, go to Part 2. Death row inmate James Eldridge, Part 2. Eldridge has now done prison sentences for burglary, kidnapping, and murder, but yet somehow he finds himself free in the late 80s. He manages to keep his head down for the next decade, but in 1998, he commits a shocking murder in Lynnwood, Washington. He invites a former lover, Eloise Fitzner, for a night out, but she's likely looking at it as just friends because she brings a friend along with her. The two women meet Eldridge at a church where he works as janitor. He introduces them to the pastor and then decides to take them on a tour before going out to dinner that night. He takes them into a private room and then pulls a knife out on the women. He binds the friend and blindfolds her, and then he takes Eloise to the side and tells her that she ruined his life. Apparently, he was cheating on his wife with her, and because of her, his wife left him. He then stabs her and strangles her, all the while her friend is listening to her pleas. He murders Eloise and leaves her body there in the church, and then takes the friend with him to his house where he rapes her for hours. And then he lets her go. Of course, she tells police and they're out looking for him. Go to part 3. Death row inmate James Eldridge, part 3. Eldridge has just murdered his former lover, Eloise Fitzner, in front of a witness. The witness he eventually lets go, and she goes straight to police, and a manhunt begins. 3 days into the search, police locate Eloise's stolen vehicle in Tacoma, Washington. As they look for Eldridge, he calls himself in and admits to everything. He's arrested and eventually goes to trial where he begs the jury to take pity on him and sentence him to death. He says, quote, "There's a wicked part of me that needs to die." Now, the jury doesn't take pity on him, but they do grant his request and sentence him to execution. He asked for a final meal of breakfast, but didn't eat a bite. He turned down a sedative that was offered to him while he laid on the table and waited for his death. He offered 0 final words as they executed him in August of 2001. Eldridge became the second to last person executed in Washington state, and perhaps one of very few who committed suicide by execution. This is the case of the Sarbacher family murder, part 1. In November of 1995, a woman in Findlay, Washington, called police to notify them that there was a bloody scene next door. When police arrived, they found that 2 women had been shot to death. 21-year-old Melissa Sarbacher, the owner of the house, and her friend 27-year-old Lisa Vera Acevedo. As they walked through the house, police were horrified to discover the body of 3-year-old Kevin Sarbacher, Melissa's son. He was dead in the master bedroom. Luckily, his 2-year-old sister Tiana was alive and well in her crib. An autopsy revealed that the little boy had been brutally beaten, raped, and drowned to death. Whoever had committed the murders also stole Melissa's Black Ranger truck. A few hours later, a woman called police to let them know she knew where the truck was and she knew the owner. That's when police confronted 25-year-old Jeremy Sagastegui. Go to part 2 to learn more. This is the case of the Sarbacher family murder, part 2. After speaking to one of Melissa's close friends, police learned that Melissa had asked her friend, Jeremy Sagastegui, to babysit her sleeping children so she could go out for a few hours. Police track down Sagastegui and they find Melissa's truck right outside of his apartment. Surprisingly, Sagastegui complies with everything police ask. He even tells them where they can find his bloody clothes and the rifle he stole from the Sarbacher house. He then goes on to tell them that the 3-year-old woke in the middle of the night crying for his mother and wouldn't stop. He started to get really frustrated, soon escalating to beating, raping, and murdering the child. He then found the rifle in Melissa's closet and sat and waited for her to return. When her friend and her arrived, he shot them without hesitation. He then asked the court if he could represent himself at trial. The judge was a little concerned by this, so ordered him to a mental evaluation, which he passed. Go to part 3 to learn about the trial. This is the case of the Sarbacher family murder, part 3. So Jeremy passes his 15-day mental evaluation and he's set to represent himself at trial. He holds nothing back. He talks about how when Melissa and her friend got home, he shot her friend first so she could watch her die. He then held the gun to her and asked her, "How does it feel?" He said he could watch the horror in her eyes as she realized her children had been left alone with him and she didn't know what he had done. And then he killed her. The court is then utterly shocked when he goes on to say he's guilty and he deserves the death penalty. He tells them, quote, "I got a thrill out of the killing. I liked it, I loved it, I want to do more." He was convicted and sentenced to death, and his mother fought very hard to get him off of death row. She said he was molested as a child and had a number of mental issues. After a nail-biting stay of execution, he was officially executed by lethal injection in 1998. 10-year-old Lindsey Baum disappeared while walking home from a friend's house on June 26, 2009. Her brother was with her, but they got in a disagreement because she took his bike without asking. He hopped on the bike and rode ahead. She walked the 10 minutes home by herself. The last sighting of her was at 9:15 p.m. when a neighbor noticed her on Maple Street. That was about halfway between her house and her friend's. When she didn't show up at home that night, her mom called police and a search started immediately. There were helicopters, search dogs, and the entire neighborhood pitched in. But she was nowhere to be found. Several suspects arose over the years, but the most interesting were 3 elderly men who were found to have hidden child pornography in their house, and with it was Lindsey Baum's flyer. I can do a video on that one if you want. 8 years after her disappearance, 2 hunters found a piece of skull in the woods. DNA linked it to Lindsey. To this day, Lindsey's case is still unsolved. There's a $35,000 reward for the tip that leads to it. This one is crazy. This is the case of the Emery Brothers from Seattle, Washington. In 2017, a woman was helping one of her elderly uncles move out of the house he shared with his 2 brothers. That's when she discovered hordes of child pornography hidden throughout the house. Shock and horror come over her as she realizes her mother was one of those children and the evidence was right there in front of her. She calls police and gets them to come over right away. That's when we learn the shocking details about the Seattle House of Horrors. Police discover pictures, videos, worn children's clothing and shoes, articles about missing kids and murdered kids, and flyers of Washington's missing children. One of those flyers is that of missing Lindsey Baum. This gives police hope that they can finally close her case, so they bring cadaver dogs on site, but they find nothing. All 3 brothers, Edwin, Charles, and Thomas, are arrested for child pornography. But only the youngest, Edwin, gets any time in prison, and he gets a whopping 9 months for decades of child abuse. I've had a lot of requests for a part 2 of the Emery Brothers, so here it is. If you haven't listened to part 1, go back and check that out and you'll get kind of a bird's eye view of the whole case. Let's talk about the little sister. So the niece comes in and discovers all this child pornography. She discovers pictures of her own mother who was abused as a kid. So the mother actually testified against her brothers in court, and she said some really disturbing things. So the mother, known as TW in court documents, was taken out of the house as a child due to the abuse, but the brothers continued to live together for years. She details that all 3 abused her at some point. Her oldest brother would take photos of her while she was nude or in a swimsuit. One of her brothers had a foot fetish and would have her wear shoes and frilly socks while he rubbed them against his genitals. And that actually lines up with the evidence they have. Hundreds of children's shoes, mostly penny loafers, hidden throughout the house. In 1994, Timothy Haag was a 17-year-old boy pushing 300 pounds and feeling very isolated from the world. He lived in Longview, Washington with his mother, stepfather, and several siblings. Kids at school picked on him, and home wasn't much better as his stepdad abused him as well. His only solace was his best friend, Alex Dillard, who lived next door. Little did Alex know that Timothy had a bit of a crush on him and was hiding the fact that he was gay. The boys had a lot in common and bonded over the fact that they were both mistreated at home. Alex came from a family of polygamists where a lot of physical abuse happened in the household. Eventually, Alex was taken out of the home and put into foster care due to the abuse. Timothy did not take this well. He lashed out at the Dillard family, blaming them for the loss of his friend. A few weeks later, Alex's sister Rachel disappeared from their yard. Check out part 2 to hear the end of the story. This is the story of Timothy Haag, part 2. Little Rachel was missing from their backyard, and it wasn't long before the Dillard family and the police were pointing fingers at Timothy. One officer goes next door to the Haag residence and speaks with Timothy, who's home alone. They're able to get permission to search the house. A group of officers goes in, and one discovers the body of 7-year-old Rachel underneath Timothy's bed. Rachel had been strangled with both hands and a belt, drowned in a bathtub, and had a plastic bag taped around her head. She was then smushed underneath the bed until the officer found her hours later. While Timothy denied it at first, he eventually came clean and said he did it to get revenge on the Dillard family, who had taken his best friend Alex away from him. Timothy Haag is currently in jail with a life sentence, but he's filing appeals regularly since he was a child when he was convicted. He's trying to get his sentence reduced. We'll see what happens.